Namesake Chapter 2. Let's get it. The door to the helmsman's quarters was an ashen wood burned with the crest of the luna, a crescent moon cradled by 3 curling stalks of rye. Caleb pushed it open, and the damp, stale smell of old paper and lamp oil encircled me as I followed her inside. Dust-filled light cloaked the room in a veil, leaving its corners inked in shadow. The uneven color of the stain on the walls gave away the age of the ship. She was old, and she was beautiful, the craftsmanship evident in every detail of the cabin. The mostly empty space was only disrupted by satin-draped chairs gathered around a long table where Zola sat at its head. Silver trays filled with food and gilded candlesticks were neatly arranged down the center of the table. The light danced on glistening pheasant legs and roasted artichokes with blackened skins, piled haphazardly in an opulent feast. Zola didn't look up as he plucked a round of cheese from one of the bowls and set it on the edge of his plate. I followed the flickering candlelight to a rusted chandelier that hung above him. It swayed on its hook over Zola's head with a soft creak, most of the crystal baubles missing. The entire scene was a poor man's attempt at majesty, though Zola didn't seem embarrassed by it. That was the Narrow's blood in his veins, his pride so thick he'd sooner choke on it than admit to his masquerade. I think I have yet to welcome you to the Luna, Fable. Zola looked at me, his mouth set in a hard line. I could still feel the sting on my skin where he'd had his hands around my throat only minutes ago. Sit. He picked up the pearl-plated knife and fork on the table, cutting into the pheasant carefully. And please, help yourself. You must be hungry. The wind coming through the open shutters caught the unrolled maps on his desk, and their worn edges fluttered to life. I glanced around the cabin, trying to find any clue to what he was up to. It was no different than any other helmsman's quarters I'd seen, and Zola wasn't giving anything away, watching me expectantly from over the candlesticks. I dragged the chair at the other end of the table out roughly, letting the legs scrape against the floor, and sat down. He looked pleased, turning his attention back to his plate, and I averted my eyes when the juice of the pheasant began to pool in the center. The salty smell of the food was making the nausea wake inside me, but it was nothing to the hunger that would be in my belly after a few more days. He stabbed a piece of meat with a fork, holding it before him as he glanced at Kala dismissively. She gave a nod before she ducked out of the quarters, closing the door behind her. I trust you've accepted that we're too far from land to take your chances in the water. He popped the bite of pheasant into his mouth and chewed. The only thing I knew for sure was that we were sailing southwest. What I couldn't figure out was where we were headed. Durn was the southernmost point in the Narrows. Where are we going? I kept my voice even, my back straight. The unnamed sea. He gave the answer too easily, as if it cost him nothing to do it, and that instantly put me on edge. But I couldn't hide my surprise, and Zola looked pleased at the sight, stabbing a piece of cheese and twirling the fork in his fingers. You can't go to the unnamed sea, I said, setting my elbows on the table, leaning forward. He arched one eyebrow, taking his time to chew before he spoke. So people tell that story, do they? I didn't miss that he hadn't corrected me. Zola was still a wanted man in those waters, and if I had to guess, he had no license to trade at the ports that lay beyond the Narrows. What are you thinking? He smirked. He sounded as if he really wanted to know. I'm trying to figure out why this fight with West is more important to you than your own neck. His shoulders shook as his head tipped up, and just when I thought he was choking on the bite of cheese he shoved into his mouth, I realized he was laughing, hysterically. He hit the table with one hand, his eyes turning to slits as he leaned back into his chair. Oh, Fable, you can't be that stupid. This has nothing to do with West, or that bastard he shadows for. He dropped the knife and it clattered against the plate, making me flinch. So he did know that West worked for Saint. Maybe that's what started the feud in the first place. That's right. I know what the marigold is. I'm not a fool. His hands landed on the arms of the chair. I stiffened, his relaxed manner making me feel as if there was something greater threat here that I couldn't see. He was too calm, too settled. This is about you. The prick of nerves lifted on my skin. What is that supposed to mean? I know who you are, Fable. The words were faint, only an echo in the ocean of panic that writhed in my gut. I stopped breathing, a feeling like twisting rope behind my ribs. He was right. I had been stupid. Zola knew I was Saint's daughter because his navigator was one of the 3 people of the Narrows who knew. That couldn't be a coincidence. If that was true, Clove hadn't only betrayed Saint, he betrayed my mother too, and that was something I had never thought Clove capable of. You really do look just like her, Isolde. The familiarity that hung in his voice as he spoke of my mother made my stomach sour. I had hardly believed my father when he told me that Isolde worked on Luna's cruise before Saint took her on. She'd never told me about those days, as if the time between when she left Bastion and joined up on the Lark had never existed. Even then, he and my father had been enemies. The war between traders is one that never ended, but Zola had finally found a weapon that could turn the tide. How do you know? I asked, watching him carefully. Are you going to pretend like you don't know my navigator? He matched my icy stare. Saint has burned a lot of bridges, Fable. Revenge is a powerful motivator. I pulled in a slow breath, filling my aching chest with the damp air. A small part of me had wanted him to deny it. Some fractured piece of my mind was hoping that Clove hadn't been the one to tell him. If you know who I am, then you know that Saint will kill you when he finds out about this, I said, willing the words to be true. Zola shrugged. It won't be my problem for much longer, he sounded sure. Which brings me to why you're here. I need your help with something. He sat back up, reaching for the bread and tearing a piece from the loaf. I watched him slather a thick layer of butter onto the crust. My help? He nodded. That's right. Then you can go back to that pathetic crew or whatever hole in Ceros you were planning to make a home of. That was so unsettling. What was so unsettling was that it sounded as if he meant it. There wasn't even a shadow of deceit in the way he met my eyes. My gaze went back to the window's closed shutters where slices of blue sea glowed through the slats. There was a deal to be made here. He needed me. What do you want me to do? It's nothing you can't handle. He peeled back the petal of an artichoke slowly before scraping the flesh between his teeth. You're not going to eat? I leveled my eyes at him. I'd have to have my toes at the edge of death to accept a meal or anything else from anyone on this ship. Do you always feed your prisoners from your own table? You're not a prisoner, Fable. I told you. I simply need your help. You just kidnapped me and tied me to the mast of your ship. I thought it best to let your fire dry out a little before we talked. The smile returned to his lips and he shook his head. Like I said, just like her. He gave another raspy laugh before he drained his glass of rye and slammed it down. Kala! Footsteps sounded outside the door before it swung back open. She stood in the passageway waiting. Kala, will you show her to your hammock in the crew's cabin? If you need anything, you'll ask her. A hammock? I looked between them confused. You'll be given your duties tomorrow, and you'll be expected to meet them without question. Those who don't work on this ship don't eat. They don't usually make it back to shore either, Zola added, a frown breaking his lips. I couldn't tell if that look was madness or mirth, but it was both. I wanted my knife back. I want my knife back. You won't need it, he said, his mouth full. The crew's been instructed to leave you alone. As long as you're on the Luna, you're safe. I want it back, I repeated. And the ring you took. Zola seemed to consider it as he picked up the linen napkin on the table and wiped the grease from his fingers. He stood from the ornately carved chair and went to his desk against the far wall, reaching into the neck of his shirt. A moment later, a gold chain surfaced from the collar and a black iron key swung in the air before he caught it in his palm. It clicked as he fitted into the lock of the drawer and slid it open. The ring glinted on the twine as he lifted it from inside and handed it to me. He picked up the knife next, turning it over in his hand before he held it out. I've seen that blade before. Because it was West's knife, he'd given it to me before we got off the Marigold in Durn to trade the hole from the Lark. I took it from Zola, the pain in my throat expanding as I rubbed my thumb down the worn handle. The feel of him appeared like a wind blowing over the decks, there 1 second and gone the next as it slipped over the railing and ran out to sea. Zola took hold of the door's handle, waiting, and I tucked the knife into my belt before I stepped out into the shadow of the passageway. Come on, Kala said, irritated. She disappeared down the stairs that led below decks, and I hesitated before I followed, looking back to the deck for Clove, but the helm was taken by someone else. He was gone. The steps creaked as we came down into the belly of the ship, and the air grew colder in the dim glow of the lanterns lining the hallway. Unlike the Marigold, it was only the main artery in a series of passages that snaked below decks to different rooms and sections of the cargo hold. I stopped short as we passed one of the open doors where a man was crouched over a set of tools, writing in a book. Picks, mallets, chisels. My brow creased as the newly fired steam gleamed in the darkness. There were dredging tools, and behind him, the cargo was black. My eyes narrowed as I bit the inside of my cheek. The Luna was a ship made for large inventories, but her hull was empty, and it had to have been offloaded recently. When I'd seen the ship in Syros, she was drifting heavy. Not only was Zola headed into the unnamed sea, he was going in empty-handed. The man stilled when he felt my gaze on him, and he looked up, eyes like broken shards of black tourmaline. He reached for the door, swinging it closed, and I clenched my hands into fists, my palms slick. Zola was right, I had no idea what he was up to. Calla followed the narrow hallway all the way to the end, where a doorless passage opened to a dark room. I stepped inside, one hand instinctively drifting back toward my knife. Empty hammocks swung from thick timber beams over jackets and belts hung from the hooks on the walls. In the corner of the room, a sleeping man wrapped in quilted canvas snored, one hand dangling. "You're here," Calla nodded to a lower hammock on the third row. "This is the crew's cabin," I said. She stared at me. "I'm not crew." The indignation in my voice sharpened the words. The idea of staying with the crew put my teeth on edge. I didn't belong here. I never would. "You are until Zola says otherwise." The fact seemed to infuriate her. "He's given strict orders that you're to be left alone. But you should know. We know what you bastards did to Crane, and we won't forget it." It wasn't a warning, it was a threat. I shifted on my feet, my hand tightening around the knife. If the crew knew I had been on the Marigold when West and the others murdered Crane, then I had as many enemies on this ship as people breathing. Calla let the unsettling silence stretch between us before she disappeared back through the open doorway. I looked around me in the dark room, letting out a shaking breath. The sound of boots pounded overhead, and the ship tilted slightly as a gust of wind caught the sails, pulling the hammocks like needles on a compass. The eerie quiet made me wrap my arms around myself and squeeze. I sank into one of the dark corners between trunks to get a wide view of the cabin while being hidden by the shadows. There was no getting off the ship until we made port, and there was no way to know exactly where we were headed, or why. The first day on the Marigold came rushing back to me, standing in the passageway with my hand pressed to the crest of the door. I had been a stranger in that place, but I'd come to belong there, and now everything within me ached for it. A flash of heat lit beneath my skin, the sting of tears gathering in my eyes. Because I'd been a fool, I'd let myself believe, even if it was for just a moment, that I was safe, that I'd found a home and family, and in the time it took to draw a single breath, it was all torn away. End of chapter 2.